In an inscription detailing his major accomplishments as emperor, the Roman Empire's first emperor Augustus said, quote, "I did not decline responsibility for Rome's food supply in the greatest poverty of grain, and I administered it in such a way that within a few days I freed the whole city from fear and present danger by my own expense and care." Not only does the emperor make sure his people can survive, he does it within a few days. And so this is an impressive accomplishment. It also is interesting that he mentions he's freeing the city from fear and danger due to a lack of grain. And this fear of revolt, fear of starvation, was not uncommon in pre-modern societies. Between 1635 and 1666, the Little Ice Age cooled the planet's temperature, and there were grain shortages throughout the world. This caused a lot of people to revolt out of unhappiness and starvation. They wanted the government to do something about it. And this is the fear that Augustus was referring to, that people would revolt or rebel and overturn his new regime. And so he continued a long line of earlier Roman politicians who either made sure the state was selling grain, starting with Gaius Gracchus in 123 BC, when there were fewer independent farmers, or they gave out grain for free, or they had a maximum price on grain so that people could afford to eat. And later on, the emperors were just giving out grain or baked bread to the people. During the Republic, before Augustus, this was a great way for politicians to ensure their popularity with the Roman people. With Augustus and later emperors, it was a good way to ensure that they stayed in charge because they were the leading citizen in a city of about 1 million people. And feeding that large of a city in a pre-modern, pre-industrial city is a massive undertaking. So how did the Romans achieve this? Most cities would get their grain or food supply from the nearby fields, from their hinterland. But Rome was, like I said, about 1 million people. Their hinterland had to be massive. They got grain from Italy. In the Republic, they also started to get grain from Italy. In the 130s, there were slave revolts, and so some more shortages of grain, which could have prompted the Gracchi brothers to try and make sure that the citizens of Rome had food, and so lowered the price of grain. They also then, shortly thereafter, acquired northern Africa, which was a great supply of food with impressive irrigation in that region. After that, in the end of the first century, the Romans conquered Egypt. They had traded with Egypt before, but starting in 30 BC, Romans controlled Egypt. So they got grain from all of these places in order to make sure that the people of Rome could eat and the emperors stayed in power. And we happen to know a lot more about Egypt due to some papyrological evidence, such as this. This is a tax roll of 172 to 173 CE, describing how much grain each person in the town needed to contribute as a tax for the Roman Empire. That sometimes people would pay taxes in grain or olive oil or other foodstuffs, and sometimes they would pay taxes in coin, cash. In Egypt, where grain was so plentiful, it made sense to collect the amount of taxation in grain so that it could be shipped elsewhere. And so the Romans needed to keep track of who was paying what amount of grain, like in this tax register. All of the grain from these people's fields was then taken to a granary or a warehouse for storing grain. Usually you want to keep grain in a nice, cool, dry place, so the floors are usually elevated. In these granaries, the grain is brought in, rooms are rented to store the grain, and then each room or part of the room had a seal to mark who contributed the grain to the warehouse. From there, the grain is shipped up the Nile to Alexandria and loaded on large ships to sail from Alexandria to Italy. And those trips could only happen at certain times of the year due to certain wind patterns. And then once the ships arrived in Italy, it was about 1 to 2 months later. With a length of 1 to 2 months, it was a little bit uncertain when these ships would actually arrive in Italy. For example, we have from the philosopher Seneca the Younger this letter saying, "Unexpectedly today, Alexandrian ships appeared within sight, those which are usually sent ahead and announce the arrival of a fleet behind them. They call them mailboats, a welcome sight in Campania. A vast mob stood on the docks at Puteoli and spotted the Alexandrians from the configuration of their sails, despite the great mob of ships. In the midst of this turmoil, as everyone rushed to the water's edge, I took great pleasure in my leisure." So Seneca is a wealthy aristocrat. He doesn't need to work. But the arrival of tons of ships bringing months worth of food to Italy would be a great source of income for this vast mob that's causing this great turmoil and excitement when ships arrive in Puteoli. And so they'd want to send smaller boats ahead to announce that the grain fleet is coming so that they can hire all of the dock workers and other people to work on unloading and loading different ships. So where's Puteoli? It's in Campania. And Campania's a little bit down the coast from Italy. The reason that the ships had to stop in Puteoli is that the Alexandrian grain fleet had pretty large boats, and the Bay of Naples and Puteoli were a great harbor. The harbor of Rome, Ostia, was not quite as great, at least not for much of the Republic and early Empire. And so the grain fleet stopped in Puteoli, and then material was transported from one ship to another to sail up to Ostia, or it could potentially be taken along a slower route by land. So let's look at Ostia. Ostia was a small town down the Tiber River from the metropolis of Rome. Like I said, its harbor wasn't great because it's at the end of the mouth of the Tiber. The Emperor Claudius tried to improve this harbor. He dug a small harbor at Ostia at the mouth of the river to provide more opportunities to load and unload ships instead of just in the river. And then he also dug a larger harbor a little bit to the north at Portus, Portus being the word for port. And in order to facilitate this harbor, he sunk a massive boat that was used to carry an obelisk from Egypt to Italy by his predecessor, the Emperor Caligula. He sunk that, and on top of that, he built a lighthouse to ensure the safety and knowledge of where the harbor actually was. All around this harbor were a bunch of sheds built for ships to be maintained and dried, kept out of the water, as well as warehouses to store goods for shipping or for later transport away from the harbor. In fact, we see a lot of these same warehouses around the hexagonal harbor built by Trajan about 50 years later to improve the shipping and safety at Portus. These warehouses we also see a lot of in Ostia. And to make sure they knew who was getting what, they'd have a system similar to the warehouses in Caranus, Egypt, or on this olive oil amphora. It included stamps that said where the oil came from. The olive oil orchards would have a place to make these large oil amphorae, and they'd say when the amphora was made, how much oil was in it, and who checked it, because this entire trade we want to make sure is legitimate, that there's no deception involved. All of these goods would get loaded and unloaded from the ships by dock workers. They'd be carried out and then taken to a warehouse. These are all of the warehouses that are known in Ostia. And we see that the riverfront has a lot of area where the boats can stop and workers can unload them and walk as straight to the warehouses as possible. And we also see a lot of interest in continuously building warehouses to store goods or to quickly unload and then reload them on other boats to go up the river. A lot of these warehouses we know are for grain. The ones with the X's are for grain. We know these are grain warehouses because they have small platforms under the floor of the storage rooms to keep the goods dry, ideally how you'd want to store grain. And if we look at these warehouses in the model on the top right, you see those platforms to keep them dry. And in the plans on the left, we see an earlier Claudian warehouse, the Horrea of Hortensius, with large rooms, a big open courtyard, and ways to go in and out, possibly bring a wagon in to load things, unload things. About 150 years later, during the Severan phase of the Grandi Horrea, which was roughly across the street from the Horrea of Hortensius, this courtyard would have been filled in, and there would be tons more rooms to store as much as possible. And we even see from the model on the right that some of these warehouses have second floors so that they can store even more grain. And the warehouse in the bottom right of the slide had a nice strong lock and nice monumental facade to show off the wealth and to secure all of the goods inside the warehouse. So these were the storage areas for grain and foodstuffs and other items that were being brought into Ostia. From there, all the goods were loaded onto smaller river boats. These river boats were managed by collegia or voluntary associations of people who were able to bring stuff up and down the river. They could take it upriver in about 3 days to get to Rome, or it would take about 1 day for goods from Rome to get down to Portus or Ostia based on canals or just sailing down the river. This is also a good time to mention that a lot of the shipping was also managed by collegia or voluntary associations that were essentially like companies or groups of business owners who were able to help make sure that Rome would get food. And these people were eventually given tax exemptions in order to make sure that Rome stayed fed. And so we get all of the food up to Rome, where it is milled into flour. Sometimes the milling was even done in Ostia at some very large mills there. either by slaves turning these large grindstones that we see in these pictures, or a horse or mule was harnessed to the grindstone in order to turn it to grind down the grain into a nice flour that could be used to make bread and then baked, either for distribution to the people or handing out the flour and grain to the people so that they could make their own porridge or bread or gruel, oatmeal type thing for their own consumption and stay alive, stay healthy, stay happy, or at least happy enough that the emperors could maintain power and avoid revolts. And that's why they put such investment into building larger harbors, building better warehouses, funding all of this travel, taxing all of these people, contracting with all of these people to make sure that food got to Rome so that the millions of people there could stay alive and happy enough that the emperor could stay alive and in power.